Las Vegas, late 1960s. A packed showroom breathing in rhythm with the music. Everything is working the way it's supposed to. The orchestra is tight. The crowd is warm, relaxed, comfortable. This is the kind of night that keeps careers safe. Then a voice cuts out of the dark. Not drunk, not loud, not accidental. Sammy is a problem. No punchline follows. No laughter saves it. The word problem doesn't float. It drops. Heavy, final. A sentence people in this town understand too well. The band keeps playing. Dean Martin doesn't. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't lecture. He doesn't even react right away. He waits, just long enough for the room to realize something has gone wrong. Then he stops the show himself. One calm sentence. No names, no explanations. And suddenly, the room is silent, in a way Las Vegas never is. Not dramatic, not loud, but dangerous. The listener doesn't know yet who said it and why that matters, why that single word could quietly destroy a career, or why Dean, a man famous for charm, timing, and knowing when not to get involved, chose this exact moment to do the opposite. And they don't know the most important thing, that Sammy Davis Jr. isn't even on stage when this happens. This isn't a story about a speech. It's about a pause, a decision made in silence, and a night that never made headlines, but quietly changed the rules for everyone in the room. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The lights over the showroom were calibrated to flatter faces, not reveal them. A soft amber wash sat low over the tables, catching the rims of glasses and the edges of sequined dresses, leaving the back rows in a careful half-shadow. On stage, the orchestra had just finished a tight, polished phrase. Nothing flashy, just enough to signal that Dean Martin was about to speak. A routine transition, the kind that happened every night. That was when the voice cut through. Not loud, not drunk, not thrown carelessly. It came from the VIP section, delivered with the confidence of someone used to being heard without raising his tone. Sammy is a problem. The word problem landed wrong. It didn't bounce. It didn't dissolve into the room the way heckles usually did. It sat there, heavy, as if it had been placed deliberately between the tables. A few musicians stiffened before they fully understood why. The drummer's right hand hovered a fraction too long above the snare. The pianist glanced sideways, not at Dean, but toward the darkened side of the room where the sound had come from. Someone near the front laughed. A reflex, thin and uncertain, then stopped when no one joined in. Dean didn't move. 3 seconds passed. Maybe 4. Long enough for the audience to notice the pause, but not long enough to feel theatrical. He stood at the microphone with his shoulders relaxed, one hand resting near the stand, the other loose at his side. No smile, no frown, just stillness. His eyes scanned the room slowly, not searching for the man who had spoken, but taking inventory of the space itself. Who was watching? Who wasn't? Who had gone quiet too quickly? He knew that word. In Las Vegas, in rooms like this, problem didn't mean difficult. It meant inconvenient, unpredictable, bad for business. A label that traveled faster than explanations ever could. What almost no one in the audience realized was that Sammy wasn't even on stage. Backstage, a few corridors away, Sammy Davis Jr. was standing near a small folding table, adjusting his cufflinks under the harsh white glow of a utility light. He was waiting for his cue, listening to the muffled sound of the room through the wall, the familiar mix of music, clinking glass, low conversation. He hadn't heard the comment. He had no idea that his name, reduced to a single loaded word, had just been placed on the table in front of several hundred people. In the VIP section, The man who had spoken leaned back in his chair. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. Around him sat others who didn't look at Dean at all, their attention fixed instead on their drinks, on the stage, on anything but each other. These were men who weren't escorted out for saying the wrong thing. These were men whose opinions traveled quietly, through hallways and phone calls and postponed bookings. Dean lifted his hand. Not high, not sharply, just enough. The orchestra stopped. It wasn't dramatic. No cymbal crash, no startled noise, just an absence where sound had been. A clean cut, like a switch flipped without warning. The silence that followed was immediate and uncomfortable, the kind that made people shift in their seats without knowing why. Dean had almost never done that. Not mid-room, not like this. Stopping the band wasn't part of the act. It wasn't charming. It wasn't funny. It was a signal that something had gone off script. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, then paused again. Another small gap. Controlled. Intentional. Somewhere backstage, a stagehand glanced toward the wings, sensing that something had changed even without hearing it. In the audience, a woman set her glass down too hard, the sound echoing more than it should have. Dean still didn't speak. The power of the moment wasn't in what he said. It was in what he refused to smooth over. He let the weight of the interruption hang in the room, unsoftened, unacknowledged. Everyone understood now that the night had shifted, that whatever came next would not be a joke designed to carry them safely forward. And the man in the VIP section understood something else as well. The room was no longer on autopilot. The silence in the showroom didn't break. It dissolved, slowly, into something else. Not sound, but memory. For Dean, it wasn't a single incident that surfaced in that pause. It was a sequence. Small moments, easy to dismiss when taken one by one. Moments everyone in the business pretended were normal. He remembered hotel lobbies where Sammy's name was quietly removed from the reservation list, not with an argument, just a polite correction. A mistake, they'd say. A manager would lean closer and suggest another place across town, farther from the strip, farther from the lights. No refusal, just a reroute. He remembered back entrances that became routine. Not because Sammy demanded privacy, because someone else did. Service corridors that smelled of cleaning solution and old carpet, doors marked staff only, that were suddenly more convenient for everyone involved. No confrontation, just habit. Then there were the jokes. They were always framed as affection. A raised eyebrow, a line delivered with a grin, laughter that arrived a second too early. The room would relax once Sammy laughed too, because as long as he laughed, it meant everything was still fine. The industry relied on that laugh. It used it as proof that no line had been crossed. Sammy learned early when to let it pass, not because he didn't notice, because noticing out loud came with consequences. He was proud, sharp, painfully aware of the math behind every booking. He knew which rooms saw him as talent and which saw him as risk. And he understood that risk didn't have to be named to be enforced. Dean had been there for most of it. He'd stood close enough to hear the lowered voices, close enough to feel the tension shift when Sammy entered certain rooms. And more than once, he had chosen the easier route. A deflection, a joke, a drink raised just high enough to redirect attention. It worked. The night went on. The contract stayed intact. That was the arrangement. Unspoken, but understood. What made it worse was that the system rarely announced itself. No signs, no policies, just patterns. Certain casinos hesitated when Sammy's name was mentioned for a longer run. Certain sponsors went quiet. A few rooms classified him as something vague and unprintable. Not ideal for the floor. Code that everyone recognized, and no one challenged. Dean had watched Sammy navigate it with a discipline that looked like ease from the outside. He never begged, never explained. He adjusted. He adapted. He swallowed things that shouldn't have needed swallowing. And Dean let him. That knowledge pressed harder than the voice from the VIP section ever could. Because this wasn't about one remark. It was about all the moments before it. Moments Dean had survived by staying charmingly neutral. He understood the stakes better than most people in the room. A public stance didn't just disrupt a show, it disrupted trust. Vegas ran on predictability, on performers who didn't make anyone uncomfortable, on nights that stayed profitable. Taking a position meant risking more than applause. It meant risking the quiet yeses that came later, behind closed doors. That was why his silence on stage wasn't hesitation. It was calculation, layered with regret. Backstage, Sammy checked his watch. He was supposed to go on soon. The delay registered, but not as danger. Not yet. Delays happened. Audiences shifted. He had no reason to think the pause carried his name. On stage, Dean felt the familiar instinct rise, the one that told him to smooth it out, to keep things moving, to protect the machine. He had used that instinct for years. It had served him well. But it suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Because he knew exactly why the word problem had been chosen. And he knew that if he ignored it, it would travel. Not loudly, not publicly, but efficiently. And this time, hiding behind irony felt like choosing a side. The room waited. Not for entertainment, for direction. The pause finally reached its limit. Not because Dean rushed it, but because the room could no longer pretend it was waiting for entertainment. He leaned closer to the microphone, just enough for the movement to register in the front rows. No clearing of the throat, no smile to soften the shift. When he spoke, his voice was level, almost quiet, the way it got when he wasn't performing but deciding. "We'll hold." 2 words. No explanation attached. A murmur rippled through the tables, then died just as quickly. Dean raised his hand again, palm open, this time not toward the orchestra, but toward the room itself. A gesture that wasn't practiced, wasn't rehearsed. It meant, stay where you are. It meant, this isn't finished. He didn't say Sammy's name. He didn't repeat the comment. He didn't acknowledge the man who had spoken from the VIP section, but everyone understood what the pause was waiting for. Behind the curtain, the shift was immediate. A production assistant stepped toward the wings, then stopped, unsure. A floor manager hissed something under his breath and reached for a phone that didn't get a signal. The bandleader stared at Dean's back, frozen, calculating how long silence like this could survive before turning into something dangerous. This wasn't how shows worked. Not here. Not in rooms that prided themselves on control. The unwritten rule was simple. You finished the number. You handled everything else later. Dean had just broken that rule without announcing it. One of the managers leaned toward another and whispered, too sharply, "He can't do this." Not because it was offensive, because it was unpredictable. Dean didn't turn around. He knew exactly what was happening behind him. He also knew that if he filled the silence with words, he'd lose the leverage the quiet was creating. So he let it stretch. Long enough for the audience to start understanding that the delay wasn't technical. Backstage, a sound technician reached Sammy first. Not dramatically. Not with urgency, just close enough to speak low. "There's a situation out front." Sammy frowned. "What kind?" The technician hesitated. A half-second too long. Dean stopped the band. That didn't make sense. Dean didn't stop bands. Not unless something had gone wrong mechanically. Sammy took a step toward the curtain. "Why?" The technician shook his head. He's not going on until you do. The words landed without volume, but with weight. Sammy stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The punchline, the correction, the just kidding. It didn't come. "That's not funny," Sammy said, not sharply, but carefully. "I know," the technician replied. On stage, Dean shifted his stance slightly, squaring himself to the audience. Still no name, still no explanation. "We'll continue," he said evenly, "when everyone who belongs here is welcome here." The room stiffened. That sentence violated several agreements at once. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't neutral either. It placed responsibility in the air without assigning it. And in Las Vegas, ambiguity like that made people nervous. In the VIP section, chairs creaked. Someone adjusted a jacket. A glance passed between two men who rarely needed to look at each other to understand a message. Backstage, a senior manager arrived, breath tight. He leaned close to Sammy, voice low but firm. "If you walk out there right now," he said, "this room is done with you." Not a threat. A statement of procedure. Sammy didn't answer. He looked past the man toward the thin line of light under the curtain. He had spent years learning when to step forward and when to stay invisible. This wasn't a moment he had prepared for. Out front, Dean waited. Not with defiance. With resolve that had already passed the point of reversal. He knew the math now. He knew what this could cost. Dates, goodwill, quiet favors that never appeared on paper. He also knew that if he filled the silence himself, he'd be choosing the same safety he always had. The orchestra sat motionless. The audience held its breath without realizing it. And backstage, Sammy stood still, suspended between survival and dignity, realizing that whatever happened next would not be undone by applause. The silence remained, not empty anymore, but charged, waiting for a single step to break it. Backstage, the corridor felt narrower than it had minutes earlier. The air carried the low electrical hum of equipment and the muffled tension leaking through the walls. Sammy stood near the curtain, hands loose at his sides, posture controlled. Not frozen, not relaxed. He wasn't rehearsing an entrance. He was calculating consequences. He knew this city's rules better than most. Vegas didn't punish loudly. It didn't shout or threaten. It simply remembered. Rooms stopped calling. Schedules stayed under review. A reputation shifted just enough to become inconvenient. Being labeled a problem didn't end a career overnight. It bled it out slowly. What made this worse was that he hadn't chosen the moment. Sammy hadn't demanded support. He hadn't forced a stand. He had been waiting, as he always did, for his cue. Now his name was pulling gravity toward him without his consent. A show manager hovered nearby, pretending to check a clipboard. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, almost apologetic. "You don't have to go out," he said. "No one will blame you if you don't." Sammy looked at him. "That's not true." The manager didn't argue. On stage, Dean remained where he was, the microphone untouched. The silence had stretched past comfort into risk. People in the audience shifted, glanced toward exits, then stopped themselves. Leaving now would be noticed. Staying felt like complicity. Neither option was easy. Dean felt the pressure rising, not panic, but the awareness that control was thinning. He could feel the room slipping from routine into something raw. This wasn't bravery. It was commitment catching up to him. He knew Sammy might refuse, and if he did, Dean would carry that decision alone. Without turning toward the wings, Dean spoke again. His voice didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. "Some of us," he said, "have spent a long time learning when to stay quiet. A few heads lifted. The sentence wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't safe either. And some of us, he continued, mistook that silence for agreement. That landed. He still didn't say a name. He didn't need to. The room understood now that this wasn't about timing or technical issues. This was about presence, about who was allowed to stand under the lights without explanation. Backstage, Sammy closed his eyes briefly. Not to steady himself, to decide. He thought of the years he'd entered buildings through side doors without comment, of conversations that stopped when he walked in, of laughs that required his participation to remain harmless. He had survived by adapting. He had built a career on excellence and restraint. Walking out there wouldn't fix the system. It wouldn't erase anything. And it might cost him more than it cost Dean. But staying back would confirm something else, that his absence was expected. He opened his eyes. The manager stepped closer, urgency finally breaking through. "If you go now," he said, "there's no walking this back." Sammy nodded once. "I know." He took a step toward the curtain. Not dramatic, not confident, just deliberate. Out front, someone in the audience inhaled sharply as the curtain shifted. The sound traveled faster than applause ever could. Dean didn't move. He didn't turn to greet him. He stayed facing the room, leaving space beside him. Not as an invitation, but as a fact. Sammy emerged into the light. The applause came late, uneven, uncertain. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition mixed with fear of being silent at the wrong moment. Sammy walked to his mark and stopped. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He stood the way he always did, grounded, composed, aware that this stage had just become something else entirely. Dean glanced sideways, just once. Not to reassure, not to perform solidarity, just to acknowledge reality. The line had been crossed. Not loudly, not heroically. And everyone in the room understood that whatever happened next would not be part of the show. The applause faded almost as soon as it started, collapsing under its own uncertainty. It left behind a brittle quiet that pressed in from every direction. Sammy and Dean stood a few feet apart, not angled toward each other, not framed as a pair. Two men occupying the same light without acknowledging it. Dean didn't reach for him. No arm around the shoulder, no signal to the band to swell and rescue the moment. The restraint was deliberate. Anything theatrical would have cheapened what had already unsettled the room. He spoke first, but not to explain. "We're going to change the order tonight," he said, matter-of-factly, as if announcing a technical adjustment. "We'll skip the next number." That sentence carried weight far beyond its simplicity. The next number was a cornerstone. Rehearsed, sponsored, expected. Skipping it wasn't artistic choice, it was breach. A ripple moved through the orchestra as musicians recalculated on the fly. Someone backstage swore quietly. Schedules existed for a reason. So did contracts. Dean didn't look back. In the VIP section, two men rose almost in unison. No confrontation, no expressions. Just coats lifted from chairbacks, a few nods exchanged. They moved toward the exit with the efficiency of people accustomed to being obeyed without comment. Their departure was subtle, but unmistakable. In this town, leaving early sent a message louder than staying angry. Sammy noticed. Of course he did. He felt the room pulling at him, waiting for something declarative. A statement, a stand, a correction. That expectation sat heavy in his chest. He had spent years watching moments like this turn performers into symbols they never asked to be. He stepped closer to the microphone. Not quickly, not with force, just enough to claim his place without permission. "I'm going to sing something different," he said. A pause. Not because of tonight, he added, because it feels right. No mention of race, no reference to the interruption, no framing of himself as wronged or defended. The choice disarmed the room. It refused the narrative they were bracing for. The band followed him cautiously, picking up the key by instinct rather than cue. The song was softer than expected, slower. The kind of piece that didn't demand attention, but earned it over time. Sammy sang without strain, without edge. His voice carried wear, not anger. Dean stayed where he was, slightly back, hands loose, listening. He understood now that the most dangerous part wasn't the silence on stage. It was what would follow off it. Decisions like this didn't end with applause. They echoed in corridors, offices, ledgers. As the song ended, the response was restrained, but genuine. No standing ovation, no roar. Just hands meeting hands, uneven but sincere. A few faces looked relieved, others looked unsettled. Both reactions mattered. Dean nodded once. That was all. The show continued, but not smoothly. Transitions were rougher. The rhythm never fully recovered. Everyone involved felt it, performers, staff, audience alike. The evening limped toward its close without the usual sense of triumph. When the final note faded, there was no encore. Backstage, the energy was wrong. Voices stayed low. People avoided eye contact. Someone mentioned tomorrow's schedule, then stopped halfway through the sentence, realizing it no longer sounded certain. Sammy sat down, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He wasn't shaken. He was tired. Tired in a way applause didn't fix. Dean passed him without speaking, then stopped. Not beside him, across the room. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't apologize. "This thing," he said quietly, "is already moving." Sammy looked up. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with the understanding that the night had detached itself from their control. Whatever they had set in motion would unfold without consulting them. Out front, the room emptied slowly. No buzz, no celebratory spill into the casino. Just people leaving with something unresolved sitting behind their eyes. The choice had been made. The cost hadn't arrived yet, but it was on its way. Morning in Las Vegas arrived without judgment. The sun climbed over the Strip the same way it always did, lighting up marquees that still promised certainty. Nothing in the city's posture suggested that a line had been crossed the night before. That was how it worked. Dean woke early, not because he'd slept badly, but because his body was used to listening for problems before they announced themselves. The phone on the nightstand hadn't rung. That alone was information. By mid-morning, the calls began. Or rather, didn't. His manager left 2 messages that said very little. Phrases like touching base and just checking availability floated without landing anywhere concrete. No confirmations, no urgency. Meetings that were better next week. Conversations that ended too politely. When one call finally came through from a familiar number, the voice on the other end sounded careful. "We love Dean," the man said, not warmly, procedurally. But last night made the room uncomfortable. Dean listened without interrupting. No accusations followed. No demands. Just a soft explanation that future dates were being reconsidered. A pause in scheduling. Nothing canceled. Nothing promised. The city never said no outright. It simply slowed the clock until momentum died on its own. Across town, Sammy heard the same tone wrapped in different words. One of the casinos where he'd been penciled in for a run suddenly needed to reevaluate audience fit. Another wanted to wait and see how things settled. The word pause came up more than once. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. A pause meant uncertainty, without timeline. It meant being neither rejected nor accepted. The worst position an artist could occupy. Sammy stared at the phone after one such call ended. He wasn't angry. Anger implied surprise. This felt familiar enough to hurt in a quieter way. What he didn't expect was where the next silence landed. Dean's calendar, once dense, once reliable, developed gaps. Not dramatic ones. Small openings that shouldn't have been there. A sponsor hesitated. A venue delayed a contract that had been all but signed. The consequences arrived sideways. By afternoon, Sammy understood what that meant. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't needed a shield. And now the shield was taking the impact. They met later that day, away from the strip. No entourage, no agenda. Just a table, 2 coffees, and the awareness that words mattered less than intent. "You didn't have to," Sammy said finally. Not accusatory, just honest. Dean looked out the window before answering. The street outside was ordinary. That, too, felt deliberate. "I know," he said. Sammy waited. Dean didn't rush to fill the space. He never had when things were real. "This town," Dean continued, "runs on comfort. I helped maintain that." Sammy let out a slow breath. "And now?" "And now," Dean said, "it's uncomfortable." There was no apology in his tone, no pride either, just acceptance. Sammy nodded. The guilt settled in then, not dramatic, not crushing, but persistent. He hadn't been the target of the consequences, but he'd been the reason they existed. "I don't want this to follow you," he said. Dean met his eyes. "It already is." They sat with that. No reassurances offered. No attempts to reframe it as noble or necessary. The moment didn't need decoration. Outside, Las Vegas continued uninterrupted. Deals were made. Rooms filled. Other shows went on without incident. But doors had shifted. Slightly. Quietly. And both men understood that what happened next wouldn't announce itself with headlines or outrage. Only with absence. The kind you don't notice until you're standing in it. Time didn't mark that night with ceremony. It didn't frame it, didn't label it, didn't return to it on anniversaries. It simply moved on and carried the consequences with it. A few months passed, then more. Careers continued, outwardly intact. Dean still filled rooms. Sammy still worked stages that mattered. But the geometry had shifted. Invitations arrived later. Negotiations took longer. Certain doors opened with hesitation instead of certainty. No one mentioned the reason. No one needed to. That was the rule everyone followed. The story itself survived in fragments. It wasn't printed. It wasn't retold as scandal. It traveled the way warnings did in Vegas, softly, selectively. Passed between agents, between musicians waiting in wings, between managers lowering their voices mid-sentence. Do you remember that night when Dean stopped the room? Not as accusation, as reference. Sammy heard it first from someone younger, a singer early in his career, careful with words, careful with posture. They met briefly after a show, nothing formal. The man lingered longer than necessary, then finally spoke. "I saw that," he said. "What happened back then?" Sammy studied him. "Which part?" "The silence," the singer replied, "when no one filled it." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't laugh at something last week. Cost me a booking. But I didn't laugh." Sammy nodded once. He didn't tell him it would get easier. It wouldn't. He didn't tell him it was worth it either. That calculation belonged to each person alone. Dean heard the story differently. Not from performers, from rooms. A manager he'd known for years mentioned it offhandedly over drinks. No judgment, just observation. You made people nervous that night, the man said. Still do, a little. Dean smiled faintly. I've had that effect. The man studied him, then shrugged. Some nights stick. They did. Late in the decade, long after the tension had cooled into memory, a small gathering took place far from any stage. No audience, no program. Just familiar faces sharing space without obligation. Someone, it didn't matter who, brought up the moment casually, like an aside. A half-joke about how quiet the room had gotten. A remark about how strange it felt at the time. Dean listened, nursing his drink. It was risky, someone said. Could have gone bad. Dean considered that. He didn't rush the answer. It did, he said. The table went quiet, not uncomfortably, attentively. He didn't elaborate. He didn't frame it as sacrifice. He didn't turn it into a lesson. There was no need. After a moment, someone laughed softly, and the conversation drifted elsewhere. The night ended without ceremony, the way meaningful nights often did. Later, as Dean stood to leave, Sammy caught up to him near the door. You ever regret it? Sammy asked. Not testing, just asking. Dean thought for a moment, then shook his head. I regret the years I thought silence was free, he said. They stood there, neither smiling, neither heavy with it. Just clear. Outside, the city glowed the way it always had. Bright, indifferent, efficient. That night, the one no one named, hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't rewritten rules or cleaned hands. It hadn't made heroes. But it had done something quieter. It had made one choice visible. And for the people who remembered it, not as drama, not as defiance, but as restraint finally set aside, that was enough to leave a mark that never fully faded.